They had rehearsed their deaths. Every woman in that camp on Saipan had been given the same instructions. When the American devils arrive, take your cyanide capsule. If you have no capsule, jump from the cliffs. If you cannot jump, use your belt, use a rope, use anything. Just do not let them take you alive. But when the gates finally opened on that July morning in 1944 and American soldiers stepped through, something happened that no amount of imperial propaganda had prepared them for. The enemy didn't come with bayonets and rage. They came with chocolate bars and bandages, and that's when dozens of Japanese women collapsed to their knees, not from bullets, but from the shock of being treated like human beings. If you're interested in untold stories from World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Now let me tell you what really happened when Japanese women faced their supposed executioners. The island of Saipan burned under the Pacific sun in July 1944. Smoke still rose from destroyed buildings, and the smell of fire mixed with salt air from the ocean. The sounds of battle had finally stopped after weeks of fighting, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. It was the silence of defeat, of waiting, of terror. In a makeshift camp near the northern cliffs, about 200 Japanese women huddled together. They were nurses, teachers, clerks, and comfort station workers who had been brought to the island to support the Japanese military. Some were barely 18 years old, others were in their 40s. All of them wore the same expression, the hollow-eyed stare of people who had accepted death. Their clothing was torn and dirty. Many were barefoot, having lost their shoes during the chaotic retreat as American forces pushed across the island. Some had bandages wrapped around their arms or heads from injuries sustained in bombing raids. Others simply had the gray pallor of malnutrition, having survived on rice rations that had dwindled to almost nothing in the final weeks. The camp itself was nothing more than a cleared area surrounded by makeshift fencing and a few damaged buildings. Palm trees, their leaves shredded by shrapnel, provided little shade. The women sat in small groups on the bare ground, some clutching family photos, others holding hands, many simply staring at nothing. They had been told that this place would be their last stand, that the Americans would arrive soon, and that capture was not an option. The morning air tasted like ash and fear. Every sound made the women flinch. The distant rumble of American tanks, the occasional crack of gunfire from somewhere else on the island, the cry of seabirds overhead, indifferent to the human drama below. Even the wind seemed to carry threat, rustling through the damaged palm fronds with a whisper that sounded like a warning. The heat was crushing. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed into the 90s, and there was no relief. The women's skin burned under the relentless sun. Sweat mixed with dirt created muddy streaks on their faces and arms. Some tried to find shade under the few remaining structures, but there wasn't enough room for everyone. The smell of unwashed bodies, of sickness, of fear itself, hung heavy in the air. And then there was the waiting. The awful, endless waiting. They could hear the Americans coming closer. The sound of boots on gravel, the rumble of military vehicles, voices speaking English, that harsh foreign language they had been taught to fear. Some women clutched the small cyanide capsules they had been given by Japanese officers before the collapse. Others fingered the belts around their waists, calculating angles and possibilities. One woman, Fumiko, a 23-year-old nurse from Osaka, sat with her back against a damaged wall. Her hands trembled as she held a small photograph of her mother and younger sister. She had written them a final letter days ago, though she knew it would never be delivered. In the letter, she had explained that she was doing her duty, that she was honoring the family, that she was choosing death over the unspeakable fate that awaited Japanese women in American hands. At least that's what she had been told would happen. The gate opened at 10:47 in the morning. Several women would remember the exact time because one of them, a teacher named Keiko, had kept her watch throughout the chaos. Time, she had thought, should be noted, even at the end. First came the sound, boots on gravel, deliberate and heavy. Then shadows fell across the entrance. The women drew back as one, a collective gasp rippling through the group. Some began to cry, others reached for their capsules. A few closed their eyes, murmuring prayers to ancestors. Fumiko felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She thought of her mother's face, of cherry blossoms in spring, of all the ordinary moments she would never experience again. Her fingers moved to the small capsule in her pocket. The officer who had given it to her had been very clear. The Americans will do terrible things to you. This is mercy. This is honor. She pulled the capsule out, held it between her thumb and forefinger. Around her, other women were doing the same. Some were already raising the pills to their lips. One woman near the back had looped her belt around a beam and was testing its strength with shaking hands. Wait. The word wasn't spoken aloud, but Fumiko felt it somewhere deep in her chest. Through her terror, through her training, through everything she had been told, a small voice whispered, "Wait. Look first. See what happens." And then the American soldiers stepped into view. They weren't devils. That was Fumiko's first coherent thought when the American soldiers entered the camp. They looked ordinary. Young men, many of them barely older than she was. Some had kind faces. Others looked nervous. A few appeared sad. The officer in front held up his hands, palms out, in what was clearly meant to be a calming gesture. He spoke in English, then waited while a Japanese-American translator stepped forward. The translator was a young man in an American uniform who spoke with a slight accent. "We are not here to hurt you," the translator said in Japanese. "The fighting is over. You are now prisoners of war under the protection of the United States military. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. No one will harm you." No one moved. No one believed him. How could they? For months they had been told stories about American brutality, about torture and violation, about deaths that were so horrible they couldn't even be spoken about directly. The propaganda had been relentless and specific, but nothing happened. The soldiers just stood there waiting. Some of them looked uncomfortable under the stares of 200 terrified women. One soldier, who couldn't have been more than 19, shifted his weight from foot to foot and wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the officer spoke again through his translator. "We need to move you to a secure location where you can receive medical care, food, and water. You will form a line and proceed through that gate. No one will be separated from the group. You will stay together." Still no one moved. Fear had frozen them in place. Then an older woman near the front, a teacher named Mrs. Tanaka, who was 48 years old and had 3 children somewhere in Japan, slowly got to her feet. Her legs shook so badly she almost fell, but she steadied herself and took one step forward. Then another. One by one, the other women rose. Some helped those who were too weak or too frightened to stand on their own. They formed a ragged line, more of a cluster really, and began to shuffle toward the gate. Fumiko found herself in the middle of the group, surrounded by other women, all of them holding on to each other like drowning people clutching at driftwood. They were led to trucks, military vehicles with canvas covers. This was it, many thought. This was where the pretense would end. They would be driven somewhere isolated, and the real horror would begin. Several women whispered frantic goodbyes to each other. Fumiko squeezed the hand of the woman next to her, a young clerk named Yuki who was only 17. But the trucks simply drove them across the island to a larger compound that the Americans had set up. When they arrived, they were directed into a long building that had been hastily constructed from corrugated metal and wood. Inside, rows of makeshift shower stalls had been set up. Medical supplies were stacked on tables. Clean clothes, simple gray dresses, were folded in neat piles. American female nurses, Red Cross workers, waited inside. They smiled at the Japanese women, which was somehow more confusing than anything else. Why would they smile? What cruelty required a smile first? Through the translator, they were told to undress for delousing and medical examinations. This was the moment many had dreaded most, to be naked before the enemy, to be vulnerable. Some women began to sob, others simply froze, unable to move. But the American nurses were patient. They didn't shout or force anyone. They demonstrated with gestures, kept their distance, and waited. Slowly, agonizingly, the women complied. They helped each other with shaking fingers, whispering encouragement, preparing for the worst. What they got instead was warm water, actual soap that smelled like flowers, not the harsh lye they had used before. Gentle hands checking for injuries and treating wounds with clean bandages. The nurses worked efficiently, but not roughly. They pointed out the clean clothes and indicated that the women should dress when they were ready. Fumiko stood under the stream of warm water and felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't pain. It was something stranger, more disorienting. It was the first moment of cognitive dissonance, the first tiny crack in the wall of propaganda she had built her understanding upon. After the showers, they were led to another large tent. The smell hit them before they even entered. Food. Real food. Hot food. The scent of cooked rice, of vegetables, of something that might have been chicken, wafted through the air. Several women's stomachs growled audibly, a sound that would have been embarrassing under any other circumstances. Inside the tent, long tables had been set up with benches. American soldiers stood along the sides, but they weren't guarding aggressively. They were just there, present but not threatening. It was confusing. Every instinct the women had developed told them this was wrong, that this calm couldn't be real, that the trap would spring closed any second. At the front of the tent, American mess workers were serving food onto metal trays. The line moved forward slowly because each woman hesitated when it was her turn, unable to believe what she was seeing. Rice, white and fluffy, not the broken, bug-infested grains they had been surviving on. Vegetables that looked fresh, a piece of chicken, actual meat, a slice of bread, a cup of water so clear it might as well have been crystal. Fumiko accepted her tray with both hands, staring down at it as though it might disappear. The clerk Yuki, still beside her, made a small choking sound. "Is this real?" she whispered in Japanese. "Are they trying to poison us?" It was a logical question. Poison would be an efficient way to eliminate prisoners, but why go through all the rest then? Why the showers and the medical care? Why the clean clothes? None of it made sense according to everything they had been taught. They sat at the tables, trays in front of them, and waited. waited for someone to tell them this was a test, a cruel joke, waited for the food to be snatched away, waited for the reality they had been promised. An American officer stood at the front of the tent. The translator beside him spoke. "Please eat. This is your food. There is more if you need it. Eat as much as you want." No one moved. 200 women sat in complete silence, staring at their trays. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. The disconnect between expectation and reality had created a kind of paralysis. Then Mrs. Tanaka, the older teacher who had been first to stand earlier, picked up her fork. Her hand trembled so badly the utensil rattled against the tray. She looked around at the younger women, at faces that pleaded with her to make sense of this somehow, and she made a decision. She took a small bite of rice, chewed slowly, swallowed. Then she took another bite, and another. Within moments she was eating properly, and her eyes filled with tears that ran down her cheeks as she chewed. That broke the spell. Other women began to eat, tentatively at first, then with growing desperation. Many cried as they ate, the contrast between what they had expected and what they were receiving too large to process without breaking down. The food was warm, plentiful, and surprisingly decent. Not amazing, but real. Substantive. Life-sustaining. Fumiko ate slowly, each bite a small revelation. Her body, which had been running on adrenaline and starvation rations for weeks, seized the food gratefully. But her mind spun in confusion. This didn't fit. None of it fit. Where was the cruelty? Where were the monsters? She watched the American soldiers around the edges of the tent. They weren't leering or making crude gestures. They weren't threatening or intimidating. Mostly they looked tired. Some looked bored. A few smiled encouragingly at the women, which somehow made it all more confusing. One soldier, a corporal with red hair and freckles who couldn't have been more than 22, noticed a woman near Fumiko struggling to eat because her hands were bandaged from burns. Without a word, he came over, picked up her fork, and began to help her eat, holding the fork steady and waiting patiently between bites. The woman stared at him in absolute shock, but she accepted the help, too hungry and exhausted to do anything else. When the meal was finished, the women were told they would be taken to barracks where they could rest. Clean beds, they were told through the translator. Blankets, safety, medical staff available if needed. They would be prisoners, yes, but treated according to international law. As Fumiko followed the group toward the barracks, she felt her legs wobble. Not from hunger now, but from the sheer weight of confusion and disbelief. She had been prepared to die. She had rehearsed her death, imagined it, accepted it. But she had never, not once, prepared for this. To be captured and then treated with basic human decency. That night, lying on a real cot with a real blanket, listening to the soft breathing and occasional sobs of the women around her, Fumiko stared at the ceiling and tried to process what had happened. The tears came unexpectedly, hot and fast, and she covered her mouth so no one would hear her cry. She wasn't crying from relief. She was crying because everything she had been told, everything she had believed was suddenly in question. And that was more terrifying than death had ever been. The barracks were simple wooden structures with rows of cots, but compared to what the women had endured in the final weeks on Saipan, they might as well have been luxury hotels. Each cot had a mattress, thin but clean, and 2 blankets, a pillow. There were windows with screens to keep out insects and electric lights powered by generators. At one end of the building was a latrine facility with actual running water. The women entered slowly, almost suspiciously. They had been assigned by groups, about 40 women to each barracks. American guards stood outside, but they didn't enter. Privacy, it seemed, was going to be respected. That fact alone was stunning. Fumiko chose a cot near the middle of the room and sat down carefully, as if the furniture might collapse under her weight. The mattress compressed slightly beneath her. It was real. She lay back and stared at the ceiling, hearing similar sounds around her as other women tested their own cots, whispered to each other, tried to make sense of their surroundings. "They're going to kill us in our sleep," someone whispered in the darkness. "This is how they do it. Make us comfortable first." "Then why feed us?" another voice responded. "Why waste the food? Maybe they're experimenting on us. Maybe the food was drugged and we'll wake up somewhere else. Or maybe we won't wake up at all." The whispered conversation bounced around the room, fear and speculation mixing with exhaustion. Some women cried quietly, others prayed. A few simply lay in silence, too overwhelmed to process what was happening. Mrs. Tanaka, who had claimed a cot near the door, spoke up, her voice carrying authority despite its weariness. "We are alive. For now we are alive. Whatever comes tomorrow will come whether we sleep or not. I suggest we rest while we can." It was practical advice, and some women took it. Exhaustion was a powerful drug, and within an hour, soft snoring began to fill the barracks. But many remained awake, including Fumiko. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the red-headed corporal who had helped feed the burned woman. She thought about the nurse who had smiled while bandaging her scraped knee. She thought about the warm water and the soap and the food. None of it made sense. The enemy was supposed to be evil, monstrous, inhuman. That's what she had been told by officers, by propaganda, by the entire machinery of the imperial war effort. The Americans were demons who would violate and torture any Japanese person they captured, especially women. It was better to die than to fall into their hands. But here she was, lying on a clean cot, her stomach full for the first time in weeks, her body clean and bandaged where it needed to be. The Americans had multiple opportunities to harm them, and they hadn't. In fact, they had done the opposite. As the night deepened and more women fell asleep, Fumiko finally allowed herself to consider an impossible thought. What if we were lied to? The thought was, small, barely formed, but it was there. And once it appeared, she couldn't make it go away. It nested in her mind alongside all her conditioning and propaganda, creating a tension that made her chest tight. Outside, she could hear American voices as guards changed shifts. They were laughing about something, sharing a joke she couldn't understand. They sounded young, tired, human. Just men doing a job, not demons savoring their captured prey. Fumiko pulled the blanket up to her chin, and finally, as dawn began to lighten the sky outside, she fell into a troubled sleep. She dreamed of her mother and sister, of cherry blossoms, and strangely of the red-haired corporal's kind face as he helped feed a woman who couldn't feed herself. When she woke, she was still alive. And somehow that was the most shocking thing of all. The days fell into a pattern. Wake at dawn to the sound of a bell, line up for breakfast, receive assignments for light work duties, eat lunch, continue work or attend medical appointments, dinner, free time in the evening, lights out at 10. The work assignments were carefully chosen to be within the capabilities of women who had been through significant trauma and deprivation. Some helped in the camp kitchens, peeling vegetables and washing dishes. Others assisted with laundry, though not their own. They were washing American military uniforms, sheets, and towels. A few with medical training were allowed to help in the camp infirmary under supervision, treating minor ailments of other prisoners. Fumiko was assigned to work in the administrative building, helping to organize supply records. It was simple work, checking inventory lists, writing down numbers, filing papers. The American staff she worked with, 2 sergeants and a corporal, were polite but distant. They didn't try to make conversation beyond what was necessary for work, and they never touched her or made her uncomfortable. After a week, she began to understand English words for common objects. Pencil, paper, file cabinet, coffee. The Americans drank coffee constantly, a bitter black liquid that they seemed to live on. One day, one of the sergeants offered her a cup. She accepted more out of confusion than desire and took a sip. It was terrible, bitter and harsh, but she smiled and nodded because she didn't know what else to do. The sergeant smiled back and said something she didn't understand, but his tone seemed friendly. After that, he brought her coffee every morning. She never developed a taste for it, but she drank it anyway because the gesture seemed important somehow. The food remained plentiful and regular. 3 meals a day, every day without fail. Rice, vegetables, meat, bread, fruit when available. Some women began to gain weight, their faces filling out, their energy returning. Others took longer to recover, still too traumatized to eat properly. The camp had a small canteen where prisoners could buy items using scrip, a form of camp currency earned through work. The prices were nominal, almost symbolic. For a few hours of work, a woman could buy soap, toothpaste, writing paper, pencils. Some items seemed frivolous, like hairpins and ribbons, but they were available. Fumiko saved her scrip for 3 weeks and bought writing paper and a pencil. That evening, sitting on her cot, she began to write a letter to her mother. She knew it might never be delivered, but the act of writing felt important. She needed to tell someone what was happening, even if that someone might never read the words. "Dear Mother," she wrote in careful characters, "I am alive. I am a prisoner of the Americans, but I am alive. They feed us 3 meals every day. We have beds and blankets. They have not hurt us. I don't understand it, but I wanted you to know that I am alive." She couldn't. Bring herself to write more? How could she explain the confusion, the cognitive dissonance, the way everything she had been told was being contradicted by her daily reality? How could she tell her mother that the enemy was treating her better than her own military had in the final weeks on Saipan? Around her, other women were adapting in different ways. Some remained suspicious, convinced that this was a temporary situation before the real cruelty began. They hoarded food under their mattresses, despite having access to regular meals. They avoided the Americans whenever possible, and spoke to them only when absolutely necessary. Others, particularly the younger women, began to relax slightly. Not trust exactly, but a cautious acceptance of their situation. They laughed occasionally at shared jokes among themselves. They began to take care of their appearance again, using the soap and water to stay clean, braiding each other's hair, trying to maintain dignity in captivity. Mrs. Tanaka, the older teacher, became an unofficial leader among the prisoners. She organized language classes in the evenings, teaching those who wanted to learn basic English words and phrases. Her reasoning was practical. If we're going to be here, we should be able to communicate. Understanding what they say gives us power. Not everyone attended, but enough did that within a month most of the women could understand simple English commands and questions. Fumiko found herself attending regularly. She told herself it was practical, but truthfully she was curious about the language, about the Americans, about this strange reality she found herself in. The contradiction gnawed at all of them in different ways. They were prisoners, but they were comfortable. They were captives, but they were safe. They were surrounded by the enemy, but the enemy brought them food and medicine. It was not cruelty, but unexpected mercy that confused them, and confusion was harder to endure than straightforward suffering. At night, the conversations in the barracks often turned philosophical, whispered questions that no one could fully answer. What did it mean that they were being treated this way? What did it say about their own nation that it had lied to them so completely? What did it say about humanity that enemies could show kindness? These were dangerous thoughts, and many women tried to push them away, but they persisted, growing stronger with each passing day of decent treatment. Letters from Japan began to arrive sporadically after the first month. They came through neutral parties and international organizations, heavily censored but real. The news they contained was devastating. Fumiko received a letter from her younger sister in early September. The paper was thin, almost transparent, and her sister's handwriting was shaky. The letter had been written in June, before the fall of Saipan, but it took months to reach her. Sister, we are hungry. Mother tries to maintain the garden, but there's little to harvest. The city was bombed again last month. Our neighbor's house is gone. Mrs. Watanabe lost her son in the Philippines. We have not heard from father since his regiment was sent to Burma. Please be safe wherever you are. We pray for your soul daily. Fumiko read the letter 3 times, then sat on her cot and stared at the wall. Around her, other women who had received letters were having similar reactions. Quiet crying, stunned silence, the guilt of survival settling on their shoulders like a physical weight. That evening at dinner, Fumiko looked at her tray. Rice, stewed vegetables, a piece of fish, bread, an apple. More food than her mother and sister might see in a week. She thought about the garden her mother tended, trying to coax vegetables from war-torn soil while American bombers flew overhead. She thought about her sister's thin handwriting, evidence of weakness and hunger, and here she was, gaining weight in captivity. Her cheeks had filled out. Her arms no longer looked skeletal. She was healthy, clean, safe, while her family starved. The irony was unbearable. Memory collided with reality every single day. The propaganda had promised that capture meant death or worse than death. Instead, captivity had brought the most stability and security she had experienced in years. Meanwhile, her family at home, supposedly safe in the homeland, were the ones truly suffering. Yuki, the young clerk who had been beside Fumiko since that first day, received no letters. Her family had been in Hiroshima, and no news came from there. The silence was its own kind of torture, not knowing if they were alive or dead, safe or suffering. Maybe it's better not to know, Yuki said one evening, but her eyes were red from crying. The camp authorities allowed the women to send letters back, though they warned that delivery was not guaranteed during wartime. Fumiko wrote to her sister, but she struggled with what to say. She couldn't tell the truth, that she was being fed and housed well. It would sound like she was happy in captivity, which wasn't true, but it also would highlight the terrible contrast between her situation and theirs. In the end, she wrote simple words. I am alive. I think of you every day. Please take care of Mother. I hope Father returns safely. I pray this war ends soon. The contrast between their two worlds created a constant, gnawing guilt. Some women stopped eating as much, unable to bear the abundance, while knowing their families starved. The American medical staff noticed and tried to intervene, but how could you force someone to eat when their mother had nothing? Mrs. Tanaka addressed this in one of her evening gatherings. Starving yourself here does not feed them there, she said bluntly. If you die of guilt, it accomplishes nothing. Survive. Bear witness. Someday when this war ends, go home and tell them what you saw. Tell them that the enemy fed us while our own people could not. Tell them that sometimes the world is more complicated than we are taught. Her words were controversial. Some women accused her of betraying Japan, of speaking favorably of the enemy, but others understood what she meant. They were living in a historical moment that contradicted everything they had been told. That contradiction needed to be remembered, witnessed, carried forward. The American abundance was visible everywhere and impossible to ignore. Trucks delivered supplies daily, food, medicine, equipment. The Americans had so much that they could afford to feed prisoners 3 meals a day without apparent strain. Meanwhile, Japan was starving. Fumiko watched American soldiers eating their meals, laughing and joking with each other. They had access to candy, cigarettes, magazines, entertainment. The contrast was striking not just between prisoners and captors, but between two nations' capabilities. America fought the war while maintaining abundance. Japan fought while consuming itself. This observation was dangerous, almost treasonous, but it was impossible to ignore. The evidence was there in every meal, every shipment of supplies, every new piece of equipment that arrived at the camp. America's power was displayed not through violence, but through sheer productive capacity, and that realization, more than anything else, began to change how the women understood the war itself. Perhaps Japan had never had a chance. Perhaps the propaganda about inevitable victory had always been a lie. Perhaps they were all part of a tragedy that had been doomed from the start. These thoughts grew stronger as weeks turned into months. They were dangerous thoughts, disloyal thoughts, but captivity gave them time to think, to observe, to reconsider everything they had once believed to be absolute truth. The turning points came in small moments, human encounters that bridged the vast gulf between captor and captive. For Fumiko, one such moment came in October. She was working in the administrative office when one of the sergeants, a man named Harrison who had been consistently kind in a distant way, noticed her struggling to understand a form written in English. She had been staring at it for 10 minutes, trying to decipher the words. He came over, pointed to each word, and said it slowly in English. Then he waited while she wrote the Japanese translation next to each word. It took 30 minutes, but he was patient, never showing frustration or impatience. When they finished, he smiled and said something. She didn't understand all the words, but she caught good work and smart. The next day, he brought her an English-Japanese dictionary. It was small, pocket-sized, worn from use. He placed it on her desk and mimed opening it and looking up words. Then he smiled and went back to his work. Fumiko stared at the dictionary for a long moment before carefully opening it. Inside the front cover, someone had written in English, "Learning opens doors." She kept that dictionary for the rest of her life. Yuki had her moment with an American nurse named Sarah. Yuki had developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. The camp doctors examined her and prescribed medicine, but she was afraid to take it. What if it was poison disguised as medicine? The fear seemed absurd given everything else, but fear isn't always logical. Sarah noticed her reluctance. Through a translator, Sarah asked what was wrong. When Yuki admitted her fear, Sarah did something unexpected. She took one of the pills, broke it in half, and swallowed one half herself. Then she offered the other half to Yuki. "See," the translator conveyed. "Same medicine, safe." Yuki took the medicine. Her cough cleared up within a week. But more than that, she had witnessed someone willing to prove their good intentions through action. It was a small thing, but it mattered enormously. Mrs. Tanaka's moment came when she was allowed to write a longer letter to her children in Japan. The American authorities could have just given her standard paper and left it at that. Instead, a female Red Cross worker sat with her for 2 hours, helping her compose the letter, asking gentle questions about her children, looking at the small photographs Mrs. Tanaka carried of them. The Red Cross worker had children too, she indicated through gestures and simple words. 3 boys. She showed Mrs. Tanaka their photographs. For a brief time, they were just 2 mothers, separated by language and war, but connected by the universal experience of loving children and worrying about them. These human moments accumulated. A guard who learned to say good morning in Japanese and used it every day when he came on shift. An American woman who taught some of the prisoners how to play a simple card game and joined them for evening. Games. A cook who noticed that some women missed Japanese food and managed to acquire soy sauce and rice vinegar, making the meal slightly more familiar. Not all Americans were kind. Some remained cold and distant. A few were openly hostile, though they never acted on it directly. Some prisoners never warmed to their captors, maintaining a wall of suspicion and resentment throughout their captivity. But enough moments of genuine human connection occurred that they couldn't be dismissed as propaganda or trickery. They were real. And they accumulated into something larger, the recognition that Americans were individuals, not a monolithic enemy. Some were kind, some were indifferent, some were young and scared, some were tired and homesick. They were human. The simple human gestures that Americans made, offering help with work, sharing a cigarette, teaching an English word, showing photographs of family, these small acts of connection were more powerful than any propaganda could have been. They were harder to dismiss because they were personal and consistent. Language barriers made these connections challenging, but humanity found ways through. A smile needs no translation. Help offered and accepted crosses all languages. Kindness, even small kindness, speaks universally. By the end of 1944, the camp had developed an uneasy but functional coexistence. Prisoners and captors weren't friends, but they weren't pure enemies either. They were people caught in circumstances beyond their control, making the best of a difficult situation. It was complicated and messy and contradicted everything the women had been taught, but it was real. And that reality was slowly, inexorably changing them. The psychological battle was harder than physical survival. At least physical survival had clear parameters: eat, sleep, stay healthy. But the battle inside their minds had no clear front lines, no obvious enemies, no simple solutions. Fumiko lay awake many nights wrestling with contradictions. She had been raised in the Japanese education system, taught from childhood about Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit that made them superior to other races. She had been told that Americans were materialistic, barbaric, lacking in honor and culture. She had been specifically warned that American soldiers would treat Japanese women as objects, as spoils of war to be violated and discarded. None of that had happened. Instead, she had been treated with a basic level of human dignity that she frankly hadn't expected. The disconnect between what she had been taught and what she was experiencing created a painful cognitive dissonance that she struggled with every single day. "What if everything was a lie?" she whispered one night to Yuki. They were in their cots, darkness providing enough cover for dangerous honesty. "Don't say that," Yuki whispered back, fear in her voice. "Even thinking it is? Is what? Did you need treason? Against what? A country that prepared us to die rather than be captured, based on lies about what capture would mean?" There was a long silence. Then Yuki said softly, "But if we accept that they lied about this, we have to question everything else. The war, the reasons for it, the sacrifices we all made. If it's all built on lies, then what were we fighting for?" Fumiko finished the thought. It was the question that haunted all of them. What did it mean if their entire worldview had been constructed on propaganda? What did it say about their nation, their leaders, their culture? The foundation of their identity was cracking, and nothing they did could stop the fractures from spreading. Some women dealt with this by doubling down on their beliefs. They insisted that the kind treatment was temporary, a trick, that the real horror would come eventually. They maintained their suspicion and hostility, refusing to engage with Americans beyond what was absolutely necessary. It was psychologically easier to believe in a conspiracy than to accept that they had been fundamentally wrong. Others, like Mrs. Tanaka, took a more philosophical approach. "We were taught what served the purposes of those in power," she said during one evening discussion. "That's not unique to Japan. But now we have a chance to see with our own eyes, to learn from direct experience rather than from propaganda. That's valuable, even if it's painful. But it feels like betrayal," a younger woman said. "To even think that Japan might be wrong about something important. It feels like I'm betraying everyone who died believing in our cause." "Or," Mrs. Tanaka said gently, "maybe you're honoring them by refusing to let more people die for a lie." These discussions happened in whispers, in corners, in careful language. They were dangerous conversations because they struck at the heart of identity itself. If you couldn't trust what your nation told you about something this fundamental, what could you trust? Fumiko found herself thinking about her father, somewhere in Burma with his regiment. Had he been lied to as well? Was he fighting for a cause built on propaganda and false promises? Would he ever know the truth, or would he die believing in the lies? The shame was complicated. She felt shame for surviving when others died, shame for being comfortable while her family starved, shame for even questioning the beliefs she had been raised with, shame for noticing that the enemy treated her better than her own military had. But beneath the shame, something else grew. Anger. Anger at having been lied to so completely. Anger at the waste of life and suffering in service of those lies. Anger at the system that had put her in a position where death seemed preferable to capture, based on fabricated horror stories. She couldn't express that anger openly. It was too dangerous, both politically and psychologically. If she let herself fully acknowledge it, what would be left of her identity? Who would she be if she wasn't a loyal Japanese subject? The internal conflict created a kind of paralysis. She couldn't go back to her old beliefs, but she couldn't fully accept new ones either. She existed in a liminal space, suspended between two understandings of the world, comfortable in neither. And she wasn't alone. In the eyes of other women, she saw the same struggle. In their whispered late-night conversations, she heard the same questions. In their interactions with Americans, she saw the same confusion and cognitive dissonance. They were all being transformed, whether they wanted to be or not. The person each woman had been when she entered the camp was slowly dying, and someone new was being born. That transformation was painful, disorienting, and impossible to stop. Past beliefs were crumbling, but nothing solid had yet formed to replace them. They existed in psychological rubble, trying to build something new from broken pieces of old certainties. The debates in the barracks became more intense as months passed. With survival no longer the immediate concern, the women had time and mental space to grapple with bigger questions. A clear divide developed between what the women privately called the faithful and the questioning. The faithful maintained that Japan was in the right, that the war was just, that American treatment of prisoners was either an anomaly or a calculated propaganda move. The questioning began to wonder if perhaps the entire framework they had been taught was flawed. These weren't clean categories. Most women wavered between them depending on the day, the news from home, their mood, but the tension was real and sometimes led to bitter arguments. "How can you sit there eating American food and talking like Japan is the villain?" One woman accused Mrs. Tanaka after a particularly frank discussion. "My husband died at Midway fighting for our country." And I honor his sacrifice, Mrs. Tanaka said quietly. But does honoring him mean I must ignore what's in front of my eyes? Does it mean I should lie to myself about what we were told versus what actually happened? It means you should maintain loyalty. I am loyal to truth, Mrs. Tanaka said. If that's the same as loyalty to nation, then Japan should welcome it. If it's not, then we need to ask why truth and loyalty are in conflict. These exchanges happened again and again, in different forms, between different women. The generational divide was significant. Older women who had more invested in the system found it harder to question. Younger women, whose beliefs were less firmly rooted, found it easier to adapt to new information. Rank also mattered. Women who had held positions of authority in the Japanese system, nurses, teachers, administrators, struggled more with questioning than those who had been lower in the hierarchy. Accepting that the system was flawed felt like accepting that their life's work had been wasted. Fumiko found herself in the middle, sympathetic to both sides. She understood the faithful women who couldn't bear to question everything they had believed, but she also couldn't ignore her own experiences and observations. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Secret confessions happened in darkness, whispered admissions that would have been unthinkable months earlier. I can't remember why I hated Americans. I know I did, but I can't remember the reason. When I think about going home, I'm afraid. I'm afraid of the hunger and the bombing. Does that make me a traitor? The sergeant taught me how to say thank you in English. I said it yesterday and he smiled. It felt good to make someone smile. Am I terrible? I had a nightmare last night that the war ended and they sent us home and everything was destroyed. I woke up relieved to still be here. Then I felt guilty all day. These confessions revealed the depth of their psychological transformation. They were being changed at a fundamental level, and that change felt like betrayal, even as it felt like truth. The growing realization among many of the women was that they had been weaponized by their own nation. They had been taught to hate, to fear, to die rather than surrender, not for their own benefit, but as tools in a larger political and military machine. Recognizing that weaponization was both liberating and devastating, some women began to discuss what would happen when the war ended, though they didn't know when that might be. Would they be able to reintegrate into Japanese society after what they had experienced? Would they be expected to lie about how they were treated? Would anyone believe them if they told the truth? We'll be living contradictions, Yuki said one evening. We'll know things that other people won't believe. We'll have experienced something that goes against everything Japan teaches. How do we live with that? We become witnesses, Mrs. Tanaka said. Not to traitors or to propaganda, but to truth. We witnessed that enemies can be human. We witnessed that what we were taught was wrong. We witnessed complexity where we were told there was only simplicity. That's important, even if it's uncomfortable. Not everyone accepted this framing. Some women maintained throughout their captivity that they were simply surviving and that survival required them to comply with their captors, but it didn't mean they accepted or agreed with anything. The moment they were free, they would return to their true beliefs. But even among those who claimed this, there were signs that the transformation was happening anyway. The way they spoke to Americans became less stilted. The way they adapted to camp routines showed acceptance rather than pure resistance. The way they discussed the war revealed doubts they might not have even acknowledged to themselves. They were changing. The question wasn't whether, but how much, and what it would mean for their futures. The most profound realization came gradually. America's power wasn't primarily in its weapons, but in its system. This understanding emerged from 1,000 small observations. The camp ran efficiently not because of brutal discipline, but because of organization and logistics. Supplies arrived on schedule. Medical care followed protocols. Problems were addressed through procedures. It was boring in its efficiency, but that efficiency revealed something important. Fumiko observed how the American military functioned. Orders were given and followed, but there was room for questions and adjustments. She saw sergeants discuss plans with corporals, saw officers explain reasons for decisions. There was hierarchy, but it wasn't absolute. People were treated as individuals with judgment and agency, not just as cogs in a machine. This contrasted starkly with her experience in the Japanese system, where hierarchy was absolute, orders were never questioned, and individual worth was sublimated to the group. She had thought the Japanese way was superior, proof of their collective spirit and discipline. But watching the American system function effectively while allowing for individual humanity made her reconsider. Democracy was a concept she had been taught to despise as weak and chaotic. But in practice, she saw how democratic principles, even in a military context, created a different kind of strength. People followed orders not just from fear, but from understanding. They worked efficiently not just from discipline, but from investment in outcomes. The individual worth concept was alien to her. In Japan, she had been taught that individual desires and needs were secondary to the collective good. Sacrifice for the nation was the highest virtue. But Americans seemed to believe that individuals had inherent value, that even enemies deserved certain basic rights and dignities. This showed in small ways, prisoners being called by their names rather than just numbers, medical care being provided not just to keep them alive as laborers, but to treat their pain and suffering, food being adequate not just for survival, but for health. These details suggested a framework that valued human life differently. The education the Americans provided was perhaps most revealing. They showed films about American life, taught English classes for those interested, provided books and magazines. Some women refused to engage, seeing it as propaganda, but others, including Fumiko, participated out of curiosity. One film showed American families in their homes with indoor plumbing, electricity, cars, appliances. She had assumed such footage was propaganda, impossible luxury staged for the camera, but the American soldiers at the camp described similar homes. It wasn't propaganda, it was just normal American life. That realization was staggering. While Japan had been mobilizing every resource for war, telling its citizens to sacrifice everything for eventual victory, America had been fighting the war while maintaining a civilian standard of living that included luxuries Japan couldn't imagine. If the enemy values our lives, why do we not? The question haunted Fumiko. Why had Japan prepared her to die rather than be captured? Why had death been presented as preferable to the reality she was actually experiencing? What did it say about her nation's regard for her life that they preferred her suicide to her survival as a prisoner? Perhaps captivity revealed more truth than freedom had. In Japan, she had been told what to think, what to believe, what to fear. Here, even as a prisoner, she had access to information and experiences that contradicted her conditioning. The irony was almost funny. She was freer as a captive in America than she had been as a citizen in Japan. The most dangerous weapon wasn't the bomb or the gun, it was dignity. By treating prisoners with basic human dignity, the Americans undermined every piece of propaganda Japan had used to motivate its people. How could you maintain absolute hatred for an enemy who fed you, healed you, and treated you like a human being? Kindness cuts deeper than cruelty. Cruelty you can resist. Cruelty confirms your expectations and strengthens your resolve. But kindness when you expect cruelty? That breaks down your defenses. It forces you to see your enemy as human, and once you see them as human, everything changes. This was psychological warfare more effective than any bombing campaign, and the Americans might not have even been doing it deliberately. They might have just been following their own principles, treating prisoners according to their own values. But the effect was revolutionary nonetheless. The breaking point came in August 1945. The women had been prisoners for just over a year. Camp routine had become normal. Many had gained weight, regained health, adapted to their circumstances in various ways. They didn't know it, but massive events were unfolding that would change everything. On August 15th, the camp commander called an emergency assembly. Through translators, he informed them that Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The reaction was not joy. It was stunned, devastating silence. Then chaos. Some women collapsed, others wailed. A few refused to believe it, insisting it was American propaganda. Many simply stood frozen, unable to process what they were hearing. Japan couldn't lose. Japan never surrendered. These were absolute truths they had been raised with. The concept of Japan surrendering was literally unthinkable, like saying water would flow upward or the sun would rise in the west. But it was true. The emperor himself had announced it. Recordings of his speech were played, his voice tinny through speakers, speaking in formal classical Japanese that was difficult to understand but unmistakable in meaning. Japan had accepted the Potsdam Declaration. The war was over. Fumiko sat on the ground where she had collapsed when the announcement was made. Around her, women were having various reactions: crying, denial, anger, shock, relief, confusion. Yuki sat beside her, silent tears streaming down her face. "What do we go home to?" Yuki whispered. "If Japan lost, what's left?" That was the question on every mind. They had left a Japan that was struggling but still fighting, still believing in eventual victory. What would they return to? Occupation, destruction, starvation, shame? The Americans provided more information in the following days. 2 atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yuki's family had been in Hiroshima. She screamed when she heard the news, a sound so primal and devastating that it seemed to come from somewhere beyond human. She screamed until her voice broke, then collapsed into sobs that lasted hours. Fumiko held her, having no words to offer comfort. What comfort could there be? Yuki's family was almost certainly dead, vaporized in an instant by a weapon of unimaginable power. The full scope of Japan's defeat became clear in pieces. Millions dead, cities destroyed, the economy collapsed, the nation occupied by foreign powers. The emperor, who they had been taught was divine, reduced to a mere figurehead under American authority. Everything they had been told, everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for, it had all been for nothing. Worse than nothing. It had led to complete and utter disaster. For Fumiko, the complete ideological break came during a conversation with Sergeant Harrison a week after the surrender announcement. He had remained kind throughout her time in the camp, always patient with her English practice, always professional but warm. How did you know? She asked him in halting English. How did America know they would win? Harrison looked uncomfortable. We didn't know for certain, he said slowly, speaking clearly so she could understand. War is always uncertain, but we had more resources, more industry, more people. Japan couldn't match our production. But we were told Japan would win, told our spirit would overcome material disadvantage. Harrison was quiet for a moment, then he said, Spirit matters. Courage matters. But spirit can't overcome reality forever. If one side can build 10 planes for every one the other side builds, spirit won't bridge that gap. I'm sorry. He seemed genuinely sorry, not triumphant, and somehow that made it worse. Fumiko realized in that moment that America had never taken Japan's victory seriously. They had known from basic mathematics and industrial capacity that Japan couldn't win a prolonged war. Everything Japan had told its people about inevitable victory had been a fantasy. She thought of all the young men who had died believing they were sacrificing for certain victory. She thought of her father, who might be among those dead, having died for a lie. She thought of her mother and sister, who had suffered years of hardship for a war that Japan could never have won. The recognition of humanity in her captors was now complete and terrible. The Americans weren't demons. They were just people from a country with more resources, fighting a war they knew they would probably win. They hadn't treated her cruelly because they didn't need to. They had the confidence of certain victory. The acceptance of this new reality was agony. Her entire worldview, everything she had structured her identity around, collapsed in that moment. She wasn't losing beliefs, she was losing herself. The person she had been, a loyal Japanese subject who trusted her nation's wisdom, died in that conversation. The pain of transformation was physical. That night she vomited from the psychological stress. Other women were having similar physical reactions, vomiting, shaking, fever from the shock of accepting defeat and all it implied. Truth, they discovered, does not liberate. It burdens. It's one thing to be lied to. It's another to realize you've been lied to about everything. It's yet another to recognize that you participated in spreading those lies, that you enforced them on others, that you judge people who question them. Fumiko lay on her cot that night, dictionary clutched to her chest, and felt like she was falling through space with nothing to hold on to. Everything solid had dissolved. Everything certain had proven uncertain. Everything she had known was wrong. Tomorrow she would have to start building a new understanding of the world, a new identity, a new framework for meaning. But tonight she could only mourn the death of who she had been and grieve for a nation that had sacrificed so many for a war it could never win. The announcement came in October. Repatriation would begin. Ships would take them back to Japan in groups starting in November. The reaction wasn't joy, it was fear. For over a year they had lived in relative stability, food, shelter, safety, routine. They had adapted to captivity in ways that felt shameful but were also undeniable. Now they would return to an occupied, defeated, destroyed homeland where they would be stigmatized as prisoners who had survived rather than choosing honorable death. What will they think of us? Women whispered to each other at night. What will they say when they see us healthy, when they're starving? How can we explain that we survived because the enemy fed us? Mrs. Tanaka tried to prepare them. Hold your heads up, she said firmly. We survived. There's no shame in that. Japan will need people who have seen America, who understand the enemy. Our experience has value. But not everyone believed that. Some women feared they would be treated as traitors. Others worried about practical matters. Where would they live if their homes were destroyed? How would they find their families? What if their families didn't want them back? Fumiko was afraid of her mother's eyes. What would her mother see when she looked at her healthy daughter, knowing she had been well fed in captivity while the family starved? How could that be explained or forgiven? Yuki faced different fears. Her family was gone, vaporized at Hiroshima. She had no home to return to, no one waiting for her. She would be returning to a country that was essentially foreign to her now, with nothing and no one to anchor her. Maybe I should ask to stay, Yuki said one evening. Maybe they need workers here. You can't stay, Fumiko said, though part of her understood the impulse. This isn't home, even if it's been safer than home. The guilt of leaving was also real. Despite everything, despite the transformation they had undergone, they were leaving comfort for hardship. They were leaving safety for uncertainty. They were leaving captivity for freedom, but freedom in a destroyed, occupied nation didn't feel like freedom at all. Some women requested delays in repatriation, claiming medical issues or other concerns. The Americans generally accommodated these requests, understanding the complexity of the situation. But delay couldn't last forever. Eventually, they would all have to go home. The anxiety permeated the camp in those final weeks. The routine that had sustained them now felt like borrowed time. Every meal felt like a last meal. Every comfortable night's sleep felt like a luxury they wouldn't have again. Every interaction with Americans felt weighted with impending goodbye. Fumiko found herself crying unexpectedly over small things. Finishing her last shift in the administrative office, eating her last American breakfast, saying goodbye to Sergeant Harrison who had taught her so much English. He shook her hand formally and said, "Good luck, Fumiko. I hope Japan rebuilds quickly. I hope you have a good life." She wanted to say something meaningful in return, but her English failed her. She managed only, "Thank you. For everything." It seemed inadequate for what she meant. Thank you for treating me like a human. Thank you for proving that enemies can be decent. Thank you for the confusion and transformation that was painful but also awakening. He seemed to understand anyway. He nodded, smiled sadly, and turned away. The journey back to Japan took 3 weeks. The ships were crowded but adequate. The women were given supplies, some clothes, basic toiletries, a small amount of food for the journey. Some received back pay for their work in the camp, a gesture that felt surreal. As the coast of Japan came into view, Fumiko stood at the rail with hundreds of other women, all of them silent as they stared at their homeland. The silence was heavy with complicated emotions: relief, fear, grief, uncertainty. The devastation was immediate and overwhelming. The port city where they landed had been bombed extensively. Buildings were skeletons of their former selves. Infrastructure was damaged or destroyed. People moved through the ruins with the slow, mechanical movements of those barely surviving. When Fumiko stepped onto Japanese soil, she expected to feel joy or relief. Instead, she felt like a foreigner in her own country. Everything looked smaller, more damaged, more gray than she remembered. The contrast with America, with its abundance and its untouched cities, was devastating. The repatriation process was chaotic. They were registered, given minimal assistance, and essentially left to find their own ways home. There was no organized support system. Japan was too destroyed, too occupied, too overwhelmed to provide structure. Fumiko made her way to what had been her neighborhood in Osaka. It took 3 days, traveling by damaged trains and on foot. When she arrived, her street was gone. Just rubble and a few people living in makeshift shelters among the ruins. She found her mother by asking neighbors who had survived. Her mother was living in a shelter made from corrugated metal and wood scraps. She was thin, so thin that Fumiko barely recognized her. Her sister was there too, equally emaciated, looking years older than she should. When her mother saw her, healthy and relatively well-fed, her expression cycled through joy, relief, and then something complicated that might have been resentment or confusion or grief. She embraced Fumiko, but the embrace was stiff, awkward. "You look well," her mother said, and there was an edge to her voice. "The Americans fed you?" "Yes," Fumiko said, unable to lie. "They fed us." Her mother said nothing more, but her silence spoke volumes. The gap between their experiences was too vast to bridge with words. Fumiko had been fed 3 meals a day while her mother scraped for scraps. How could that ever be fully forgiven or understood? That night, lying on the floor of the metal shelter, listening to her mother's labored breathing, Fumiko understood that she had lost her home in ways that went beyond physical destruction. She had changed too much. She had seen too much. She knew things that made it impossible to go back to who she had been. She was home, but she was also forever displaced. The years that followed were difficult. Japan rebuilt slowly under American occupation, and the women who had been prisoners carried their experiences in silence. It wasn't safe or acceptable to speak openly about how they had been treated. The narrative in Japan was about suffering and victimhood, not about enemy kindness. Fumiko married eventually to a man who had been too young to fight in the war. She never told him the full truth about her captivity. She said she had been a prisoner, that it had been difficult, and left it at that. He didn't push for details, perhaps sensing that there were stories too complicated to tell. She worked as a translator as Japan rebuilt, using the English she had learned in captivity. The dictionary Sergeant Harrison had given her sat on her desk for 40 years, its pages worn soft from use. When her husband asked where she got it, she said simply, "It was a gift." She had 2 children, a son and a daughter. When they were old enough, she told them carefully edited versions of her experience. "The Americans treated us according to their rules," she said. "They weren't cruel. War is complicated." Her daughter once asked, "Did being a prisoner change you?" Fumiko thought for a long time before answering. "Yes," she finally said. "It taught me that the world is more complicated than we're told, that enemies can be human, that sometimes what you think is true is actually propaganda. Those are hard lessons, but important ones." She kept in touch with some of the other women from the camp. They would meet occasionally, never frequently, and speak carefully about their shared experience. Mrs. Tanaka became a teacher again and sometimes gave lectures about the importance of critical thinking. Yuki moved to Tokyo and worked with war orphans, channeling her grief into helping others who had lost everything. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, Fumiko received a letter. It was from Sergeant Harrison's daughter. Harrison had died, the letter explained, and in his effects, they had found a small notebook where he had written about his experiences in the war. He had mentioned Fumiko by name, described teaching her English, said he hoped she had survived and had a good life. The daughter had tracked Fumiko down and was writing to share this. My father spoke sometimes about his time as a prison guard, she wrote. He said it taught him that even enemies are just people caught in circumstances. I thought you should know he remembered you kindly. Fumiko read the letter 3 times, then carefully filed it with her dictionary. That evening she wrote a letter back, her English still careful and correct after all those years. She told Harrison's daughter that her father had been kind, that he had made a difference, that she had never forgotten him. Some wounds from war never fully heal, but some connections, even between enemies, endure. And so the soap, the food, the simple human decency became more than survival. They became proof of something that no propaganda could explain, that enemies can show mercy, that humanity persists even in war, and that sometimes the hardest thing to survive isn't cruelty but unexpected kindness. For those Japanese women who prepared to die in 1944, who held cyanide capsules and stood at the edge of cliffs, captivity became something they never expected, a chance to see the world with new eyes. They learned that what they had been taught was wrong. They discovered that the enemy was human. They found that suffering and survival are more complicated than propaganda suggests. It didn't erase the war's horrors. It didn't justify the deaths or the destruction. But it added complexity to a story that both nations wanted to keep simple. Japan wanted to be the victim. America wanted to be the hero. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. As Fumiko told her grandchildren near the end of her life, when they asked about the war, I learned that the most dangerous thing isn't the enemy you can see, but the lies your own side tells you. We were prepared to die because we were told the Americans were monsters. They weren't monsters. They were just men. And realizing that we had been lied to so completely, that was harder to survive than any battle. She paused, looking at old photographs, at the worn dictionary on her desk, at a lifetime of memories both painful and profound. The hardest prison to escape, she said finally, isn't one made of wire and walls. It's the one made of lies you've been taught to believe. The Americans opened the gates to the physical prison in 1944. It took me years to escape the other one. And that is the story worth remembering. Not a simple story of good versus evil, but a complicated story about humanity, propaganda, transformation, and the unexpected ways that enemies can teach us about ourselves. If this story made you think, if it challenged your understanding of World War II, if it reminded you that history is always more complex than we're taught, then please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll continue bringing you these untold stories, these complicated truths, these reminders that even in humanity's darkest moments, there are sparks of light that complicate our understanding and challenge our assumptions. Because these stories, uncomfortable as they sometimes are the ones we most need to hear. They remind us that enemies are human, that propaganda is powerful, and that truth is always more complicated than we want it to be. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, history is not simple, and that's precisely why it's important.